Great. Welcome, everyone. This has actually turned into a series from an idea into something that will actually get bigger, and super glad to start with Bangladesh and Pakistan. Number one, I'd like to welcome everyone. Number two, my name is Ovais. I'm a partner at Rise Capital, which is an emerging markets, if you want to call it that, investor across Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. And very familiar, obviously, with the Pakistani ecosystem and its evolution. And in addition to that, we're looking to expand, as I described earlier, this corridor series to cover a number of interesting geographies over the next few months: Egypt, Indonesia, Singapore, Nigeria, Turkey, you name it. So we're kicking off today. Great opportunity to see how this works, and great opportunity also for feedback. Got a number of guests. We're going to be kicking off shortly. Great. Syeed has just joined, and looking forward to everybody's contribution. I'll start with a couple of things. Just a small personal note in remembrance of a Bangladeshi founder who we lost a couple of years ago, Fahim Saleh. Fahim was an investee of ours at Gokada in Nigeria, and preceding that, grew up in Saudi Arabia, went to college in the US, and set up a very exciting business also in Bangladesh before venturing to Nigeria to set up a tremendous business which has achieved huge success for everybody. So a quick note of remembrance for Fahim, great friend of ours, and a fantastic founder. So anyway, moving on. What we'll do is we'll kick off with a little bit of an intro from each person, and then we'll go into the core subject matter. I think, broadly speaking, from my perspective, having been lucky enough to invest in and experience a number of markets over the years, from Colombia to Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, Pakistan, etc., and more recently, obviously, Saudi Arabia and the GCC. There is a thesis around critical mass, and that critical mass historically used to be 50 million internet users. If you take the US and China and Russia and India, and then later on Indonesia and Turkey and Pakistan and the GCC, there was always a thesis that once you reach a certain critical mass, the enabling layers around the internet start building in terms of e-commerce, in terms of payments, and in terms of logistics and so forth, and in terms of content platforms as well. So I don't know if that's 50 million now or 30 million. I think everything's changed, and I don't think the same rules apply anymore. But the reality is you're starting to see the emergence on a fast track of so many interesting geographies. A couple of years ago, Vietnam and so forth, and Bangladesh, I think, has really begun to get on the map. And we hope, and I'm sure, will follow the same pattern as we're seeing in markets like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which is a significantly accelerated growth, enormous build-up of the ecosystem, and tons of both domestic and foreign capital coming in. So I'll pause there for a second and pass over to Sylvana, if you could kindly kick off, and then we'll go around the virtual table.
Sure, yes, I'll just introduce myself quickly. I'm Sylvana Sinha. I'm the founder and chair and CEO of Praava Health, which is a fast-growing consumer healthcare company in Bangladesh. I moved to Bangladesh for the first time 6 years ago to start my company, actually, although my family is originally from Bangladesh. I'd never lived here before starting my company, but I'd worked in emerging and frontier markets in my entire career and just fell in love with the problem, and I wanted to be part of trying to solve the challenges of healthcare in this country.
Fantastic. And thank you very much. Shahir, shall we follow up with you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ovais. So quick introduction to myself, Shahir. My name is Shahir. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Shikho, which is an education technology company building a hyper-localized learning ecosystem for Bangladesh. So it's a mobile-first digital learning platform. About myself, so I spent the last 16 years in the UK, although I grew up in Bangladesh. So I was a banker in London, initially in Barclays and then in HSBC, but I just moved back 6 months ago. So this is I guess home, second chapter of home for me now, back in Bangladesh, but very exciting times, obviously, and I'm glad to be back.
Fantastic. Kalsoom.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Kalsoom. I'm the co-founder and general partner of IDI Ventures. And prior to that, have been the founder of a company called Invest2Innovate. So we've been pretty solely focused on the Pakistan startup ecosystem, though our sister company, Invest2Innovate, which I founded 10 years ago, was one of the earliest players in the Pakistan startup space. And as a result of the work we were doing in Pakistan, we started to also do and support incubators and accelerators in other markets, including Bangladesh. And now I'm fully, with my partner Misbah, fully a general partner with IDI Ventures, which is an early stage venture capital fund, investing in startups that are addressing some of Pakistan's largest problems. A little background on me and probably why I'm here in this conversation as like the not focused on Bangladesh person, but has a Bangladesh connection. My mom is Bangladeshi and my dad is Pakistani, and I spent half my life, either childhood in Dhaka, and then spent the rest of my time in Islamabad, which is where I finished high school. And so for me, kind of having the lens of both gives me a really interesting vantage point. I'm obviously also very passionate, as much as my work is focused on Pakistan right now, very passionate about the intersection of Bangladesh and Pakistan, especially given my background. And so have done a lot of work with players there, good friends with some people on this call. And so really excited to be in this conversation.
Great. Rahat, hi.
Hey, excited to be here. Thanks for having me. I am a Bangladeshi who left for the US when I was fairly young. My background involves public market equities and emerging markets and frontier. I've actually traded Pakistan before, was very active in Dhaka. And somewhere along the way, it was incidentally Fahim Saleh who got me into the startup ecosystem here in Bangladesh when he first told me about a company called Pata, which has gone on to become one of the largest startups in the country. Since then, in 2019, it was here and met with a bunch of founders. I thought it was very interesting, and noticed there was a early opportunity for capital. So in 2020, we launched Anchorless Bangladesh, which is a New York-based venture capital fund. We only invest in Bangladesh early stage startups, which is something we're very excited about. We've now made 6 investments. We've got a few more coming up in the next few months. Very excited. And look forward to sharing what we're doing with the Pakistani community, which congratulations on the fantastic 2021, everybody.
Fantastic, thank you. And Syeed, over to you.
Hi everyone, hi, nice to meet everyone. So yeah, I'm Syeed, co-managing partner of Osiris. I've been in Bangladesh since 2008. As you can probably tell, I have a Scottish accent, so I'm a Scottish Bangladeshi, a rare breed apparently. But so yeah, we're essentially a private equity firm, but we also do VC investments. So we've made six or seven VC investments, tech investments to date, but we also make investments in healthcare, renewable energy, as well as digital infrastructure. So we've been around since about 2015, investing in Bangladesh. We have a keen eye on Pakistan as well. We've yet to make some investments there, but we will probably be making some investments there soon.
Fantastic, thank you. So just kicking off, I mean, I remember the days 4 or 5 or 6 years ago when I was lucky enough to be an investor in Kareem, and on the map was obviously Saudi Arabia, UAE, Pakistan, Turkey a little bit difficult because very hard to get into the ride-hailing industry there vis-a-vis licensing of licensed cabs. But we always looked at Bangladesh as an opportunity, but could never really get to grips with it by virtue of lack of knowledge, lack of people we knew, and generally, uncertain around, how do you execute in a market that none of us were familiar with. So the economics looked interesting and the dynamics seemed similar to Pakistan, but with very limited knowledge. So what I'd love to do is pick up because, obviously we see, as I described earlier, the emergence of many, what used to be called emerging markets and are now high growth markets. So I'll pass over to Rahat really and kick off with you, if I may. Frame Bangladesh if you can, and other people can jump in as well around, what's happened in the last couple of years. Where do you see the trajectory? What are a couple of the key success stories? And where do you see it headed vis-a-vis reference to any other markets that you think are good comparables?
Sure. I think the most interesting about Bangladesh, if you look at the macroeconomic story, it's arguably one of the best in the world, if not the best. I think, honestly, I've said it before, I think Bangladesh and Pakistan are both up there. And when we look at all the capital that's out there in the world, especially for people who are looking at on a macro basis at emerging and frontier, I think both of these countries, including Bangladesh, should be given some sort of weight, even if it's at the tail end of their book. And this is partially driven by the fact that the demographics have a couple of really, really strong points. One is the median age right now is 27. And it's a country, the size of Iowa, but with half the population of the United States, right? If you overlay that with the fact that GDP per capita in the country has gone from $350 in 2006 to about $2,500 now, and the economy as a whole is going towards 500 billion. There's a significant amount of opportunity. The middle class is waking up every day with 50% more disposable income than the year before. That's got to go somewhere. So whoever is able to build products and services that they can consume, they're going to benefit. And I think one of the things that we are following footsteps in is I think the Indonesian consumption story has been phenomenal, and what Pakistan has been able to do in bringing in international capital has been fantastic. And I believe that we will do that. I think the next 2 years, 3 years for Bangladesh is it's a significant inflection point. One key statistic from our side, we've done 6 deals, we've got a few more coming. I can tell you at the beginning, it was hard to get co-investors in, and now the deals are getting to be multiple times oversubscribed. So we can see that almost, I don't want to say FOMO's there yet, but I think it will get there, which is great, I think, for the market.
Tremendous. Okay. And I'll pass over, Syeed, for your perspective as well, because, given your background and exposure, I guess, to Europe and other markets, how do you see Bangladesh forming and accelerating?
Look, I think beyond what Rahat articulated, which I fully agree with. I think what's also happened in the last 5 to 10 years is that what you've seen in terms of that demographic and certainly a young consumer base, you've seen the digitization of the country. So I think various kind of pillars have also kind of been established over that time, whether it be payments, whether it be logistics, whether it just be customer adoption. The underlying is obviously smartphone adoption. But I think what we're seeing is basically people have become much more digitally active. I think a large chunk of the population are connected to the internet now. So I think it is as a underlying kind of infrastructure as well as a tailwinds. What you're seeing is people are just using a variety of digital products and services. And I think that acceleration will continue to happen. I think COVID, beyond the obvious negatives of COVID, but the positive, the silver lining, if you want to call it that, has been that has also seen an acceleration in digital activity. I think with more investment dollars coming in, and actually business models also becoming more and more refined, because I think there's a phase in certainly markets like ours where there's an exploratory phase where people are sort of testing out different business models, or whether it be the regulatory environment is still not clear. I think that's all becoming a lot clearer. Fintech's a great example where there was a variety of kind of models one could follow, but it's becoming clearer and clearer now. We've invested in a couple, so it's becoming much clearer now what the path forward is. So I think that overlaying the kind of broad macro story is definitely, I think the timing now, I came here in 2009 and 8. So, market timing is always very important. But I think, from at least having some degree of perspective historically, I can certainly see the acceleration happening now, which will be the base for companies like Shahir's or indeed Sylvana's in health tech or in ed tech, where I think the timing is much more the actual underlying is much stronger now than it has been certainly in the past.
Great. And a question actually for Sylvana and Shahir as well, which is, given one of the big success factors in many geographies, I've seen it in Egypt, seen it in Pakistan, certainly, seen it in Saudi Arabia as well, which is the diaspora, in a sense, seeing opportunity to bring something back to the home country insofar as skills, in terms of the ability to support and help. Often in the absence of the big solutions from government, sometimes the private sector takes on a larger burden, and individuals and energetic individuals see what they can do to bring solutions to the country. What are your experiences of, you know, how welcoming and how similar it's been to other markets for Bangladesh diaspora people like yourselves to come back and make a change? I guess Sylvana.
Shahir, would you like to go? Sure, I can go first. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I do think I'm still perceived probably as an outsider, and I think that's just the reality. I think that when I first came here, and I think this worked to my advantage, but I think a lot of people sort of underestimated my ability to get to understand the landscape and the challenges and all of that. But I think that the advantages that you start to see are just the ability to bring global networks and global expertise into the market. That really allows us to leapfrog, right? I mean, we don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to healthcare or when it comes to, you know, other industries. And so I think that that's true. I mean, I think that there's starting to be more welcoming of it, especially as it comes with capital, right? And I think that, you know, if we're bringing, you know, all of our investors are non-Bangladeshis actually, and we've raised $12 million for this market to bring better healthcare to this country. And I think that, you know, with that, things and attitudes are starting to evolve, certainly.
Fantastic. Shahir?
Yeah. I guess, you know, for me, the experience has been sort of different. So I grew up in Bangladesh. I left here when I was 16. So I still consider home both London and Dhaka. But yeah, having said that, I do think I'm sort of in a privileged position, you could say, that I've got both the best of both worlds, right? So this is sort of, I understand how it operates on the ground in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, but the best practices that you learn having spent, you know, 16 years, you know, professionally in London, working alongside, you know, some of the best, and then picking up those best practices that you can then bring back home, right? And make it sort of part of your thesis in terms of how you build out a company from the ground up, right? That's one of the things I would say that probably helps. But yeah, I think generally we're very welcoming of, you know, and I think we need to be more welcoming of the diaspora because there's so much talent out there that will come back in and help, you know, even local, you know, founders or local, you know, there's so many people, there are engineers that are out there that we need to sort of bring back into the home and give them a reason to come back, actually. So I think more and more as we develop the ecosystem, we're just going to see a lot more of the diaspora come back in.
Yeah. So passing over to you, Kalsoom, I think I was interested actually with your presence on the panel for the simple reason that, you know, interested in the parallels with Pakistan, and given what you know and given your experience and given what you've heard in the last 20 minutes, you know, how do you see the success factors in Pakistan as it played out in the last couple of years? And how do you see, you know, what would be your lessons of the 3 or 5 things that you think are the accelerating factors in the evolution of an ecosystem that can apply to Bangladesh?
Yeah, and I think honestly, in a lot of ways, Bangladesh, to me, from a macroeconomic standpoint, is doing much better. I mean, it's not just my perspective, that is the actual perspective. It's doing much better than Pakistan is right now. So what's interesting to me is Bangladesh is really poised for that same growth. And actually, you know, similarly last year, Bangladesh actually had like tremendous amount of growth when it came to investment. And obviously SoftBank invested, Tiger just invested in ShopUp. So similar investors that, I mean, Tiger just came into Pakistan through Creditbook as well, right? And is looking at the market quite seriously, which is a very strong signal. So, I mean, I think my vantage point is that I tend to obviously first see the similarities first. And I actually think with Bangladesh and Pakistan both, there's a lot of similarities to early emerging markets in terms of the sectors that come up first. Rahat was obviously talking about Badal and like a bunch of those companies. We tend to see e-commerce, fintech, logistics coming up, but because fintech is such a highly regulated sector, to what Syeed was saying, is that if you don't actually improve the regulatory barriers in that space, you won't really see it take off that way. And so in Pakistan, what we really saw happen, startups raised $350 million in 2021, and the majority of deals, the highest quantum of deals, even though the most amount of money was raised by e-commerce, the highest number of deals was in fintech. And that's because the regulatory environment just got significantly better. The state bank is actually quite progressive in Pakistan under the current regime. And so we saw very game-changing legislation happen, which really allowed that space to take off. And so I would say that the same for Bangladesh as well. Like as the regulatory environment improves, I think you start to see just the barriers overall lower. I think the interesting difference between, and Rahat and I've talked about this actually, the interesting difference between the two is that, Pakistan is quite spread out. We have 3 to 4 major cities. We have a lot of tier 2, tier 3 cities. So there's just a lot of expanse in terms of where you have to basically conquer. So if a startup for me starts in Islamabad and wants to go to Karachi, it's just dramatically different, the economies and the unit economics and like how you scale and the environments, right? Versus in Bangladesh, like Dhaka is really where a lot of the concentrated population is. And then Chittagong obviously is there as well. And so in a lot of ways, like the city that you start in as a testing ground actually becomes like a really good litmus for everything else, versus in Pakistan, they're so dramatically different from each other. So for one thing, I would say that, the regulatory environment continuing to improve is something that every emerging economy needs. I would say the same for Pakistan as well. We still have a ways to go. And I would say the same for Bangladesh. I think as we're seeing international investors come in, I think that also starts to change the game a little bit, right? I know that Bangladesh, for instance, had a lot more local investors, local angels, like people that were coming up in the market. I think now with the introduction of like with Anchorless coming in, but also a lot of other, larger international funds, to Rahat's point about FOMO, in some ways it's good because it creates good competition. It kind of also forces the local investors or the local environment to really step up their game and be more competitive, be more professionalized. It's what we saw in Pakistan as well. I think this past year, it was like basically 4-to-1 international to local in the deal. Some of the deals that I've been in have been some of the most competitive deals in the market, and you had to fight to be part of it, right? So in some ways that's really good. It's good for founders because I think the scarcity that exists for founders in both of our markets often means that you're taking deals on the table in these scarcity environments that may not be the best deals for you, but are giving you money when you need it, versus now, hopefully those options are getting better. So I would say those are the things that I think are really important. And then I think this just generally the support environment, whether it's like, co-working spaces, whether it's incubation acceleration, whether it's like thinking about all the different ways serendipitously that founders are coming together. I think those are really important things. And obviously I've seen a lot of those programs happen in Dhaka, but just those things need to happen more in Pakistan. Some of the best things that have happened is when we had 021 Disrupt, which was our big tech conference, just like the serendipity that happens, the types of collaborations that happen in those environments, which obviously because of COVID, we haven't been able to do in person as much, but I think all of those things mattered to both places.
Great. And just, obviously from experience, if I were to put in a couple of other markets, spent most of my time, certainly in the last decade, in the GCC Middle East region, and you've seen, I think the big driving force here has been the role of government. I mean, we're privileged in the Middle East, in the GCC particularly, with the government in the UAE and the government in Saudi Arabia having tremendous financial resources to be able to literally pump money into the ecosystem and set up, in the case of Saudi Arabia more recently, substantially large funds to drive both the evolution of startups and also the presence of local GPs. So you're seeing the same phenomenon in Pakistan. I think what you're seeing in the last 12 months has been the embracing by the government of, as much as possible, deregulating, making it easier, building free zones, encouraging the flow of kind of talent and knowledge, and the government at prime ministerial presidential level being seen to be active supporters of entrepreneurship and the ecosystem, as well as the academia alums and IBA and so forth. So I wanted to bring you into that conversation, Rahat, in terms of how do you see the role of government in Bangladesh and what can be done to mobilize and energize the government looking at this and going, hey, the future doesn't lie with the World Bank. It lies with talented Bangladeshis creating jobs and building the ecosystem to drive our economy.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give some context on the local and global numbers. Historically, Bangladesh has raised about, I think, $475 million total. Of that, I think about 30 to 35 is local. So you can tell it's a significant global. Last year, I think it was like 130 to 10 roughly. So there is a need for local investors to get more active. Now, part of that is regulatory reform that's necessary. And we talked to the government on this, and organizations like the central bank have been very, very supportive and progressive. And in fact, we're looking at models similar to Pakistan and elsewhere where the change of certain regulatory structures has actually spurred significant fundraising. And you've seen the difference between 2020 and 2021 in Pakistan. In terms of the direct investment side, last year, maybe the year before now, time just flies, the government in Bangladesh launched Startup Bangladesh Limited, which is actually the government-backed sovereign fund. And that's a very exciting thing from the government, showing directly that they're willing to put in money and show support while staying relatively independent, which I think is a fantastic project. And I'd like to continue to see the growth of that, because I think it'll play a significant role, especially for a lot of the startups that just need that initial kickstart to get to that next step.
Yeah. If I were to shift into sector a bit and, talk about three sectors, if I may, one is education, one is healthcare, and one is e-commerce. So kicking off perhaps with you, Sylvana, if we were to cover healthcare as you see it and the evolution of healthcare and health tech, and obviously given the nature of your platform, and then we'll move to education, and then perhaps I'll get Syeed to talk about e-commerce. How do you see the evolution of the healthcare sector in terms of both capital, startups, and the role you're playing in driving that area of solving a problem?
Sure. Well, first I'll say that healthcare is never the first sector to attract capital in an emerging market, which is unfortunate because healthcare consistently in emerging markets grows 1 to 2 percentage points faster than GDP. But that's just the way it goes. I saw a question come through that was, does it bother you that startups are predominantly following a cookie cutter approach and replicating business models established in the US and EU? And my answer to that is a resounding yes, especially in healthcare. Because, and I'll tell you, when I started my company, when I first had the idea that I wanted to do something in healthcare in Bangladesh in 2014, a lot of people said to me, why don't you just build Uber of? Everybody was obsessed with Uber of models at that time, right? And a lot of people said to me, why don't you build Uber for healthcare in Bangladesh? And from what I understood of this country, that made absolutely no sense to me, because Uber of only works if you have underlying infrastructure. And in Bangladesh, the doctors are spending an average of 48 seconds per patient. The only country where they spend less time with patients is Pakistan, where it's 45 seconds, I think. There's only one internationally accredited lab, and 10 to 15% of drugs in the market are counterfeit. So I was really not interested in building a business where I was connecting patients with doctors who weren't going to spend time with them, with labs that were running their tests without any quality standards, and with pharmacies that were going to sell them counterfeit drugs. I mean, there are business models that are being built around these things, but that was not a business that I was interested in. In addition to the fact that when you actually own the supply chain on all of those three pieces, which is what my business does, your margins are a lot more compelling. So I would say what we're trying to do is really combine technology and infrastructure in a meaningful way. And we had to do that because the infrastructure wasn't here. And so I think, healthcare is really a special case in that regard because of that fact, because in emerging markets, in many cases, the infrastructure simply is not there.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to pick that up, Shahir, in terms of education? Because, as I said, as Sylvana was also saying, I mean, content and e-commerce tend to be where, tech sectors start in emerging markets. We look at Indonesia and so forth with Tokopedia and Bukalapak and all those early players in the early 2010s. So what's your experience in the education sector in terms of both the ability to attract capital and the type of reception you've received?
Yeah, so I mean, education is an interesting space, especially for Bangladesh, right? Because we've got such a large population. I think, one of the things very much
young
like
population.
Yeah, young population. Like you need education, right? There's no escaping it, in the sense that 180 million people, half of which is below the age of 25. So you've got 90 million essentially who are going to become a learning age population. So we've got a very, very, very big population to go and serve. The trouble with what education is in an emerging market like Bangladesh is you've got a supply demand sort of break, right? So you've got this massive demand, but not an infrastructure to provide that supply of teachers, much like in healthcare. So that's where we bridge the gap in the sense that we're providing we're democratizing access through geography, through the affordability rates by using a mobile first solution. And as Syeed mentioned earlier, this is now really coming to fruition because you actually have low-cost smartphones available across even rural Bangladesh. So I'll come on to it a bit later, but a large part of our users are coming, 65% of it is coming from rural Bangladesh. So it's not even an urban solution. Now, in terms of, I guess, the access to capital and what we've been doing, I mean, we're still fairly early as a sector, right? So education, technology, ed tech, as a sector has raised $5 million in totality in Bangladesh, historically. We've raised 1.6 million of that. And that's only happened so last year. So I think from a sector perspective, we're still very early. If you look at our neighboring countries, right, you look at India, they've done 6 billion plus of edtech investments since 2013 onwards. So I think you're right, Ovais, in the sense that, edtech isn't the first market to get effectively, you need e-commerce, you need the rails around fintech, but then you're looking at education technology is one of those things that will happen because you're solving for this demand supply gap. And as you've got the other bits sort of solved, you can really push this solution and get it in front of people, and a lot of people at this point in time.
Yeah, yeah. Before we move on to e-commerce, actually, I think if I were to then contrast it with another market like Nigeria, again, been lucky enough to have a chunk of experience there, and we talked obviously about Okada. And one of the big factors in the success of Nigeria, relatively speaking, has been the focus of European investors, particularly on sub-Saharan Africa, and the emergence of local GPs, but predominantly foreign investors in Nigeria, and to a lesser extent in East Africa, but with a particular emphasis on Central and West Africa, and players obviously like Rocket Internet and so forth, who really embraced the African thesis with Jumia, and Daraz obviously in Pakistan as well. So I wanted to ask, maybe I'll pass back to Rahat before we go. Maybe Syeed, if you pick up. From the perspective of European investors and the perception of Bangladesh among the usual suspects, the kind of CDCs of this world and some of the sovereigns and some of the family offices and corporate institutions and DFI-like organizations, what's the perception of Bangladesh, do you think, with regard relative to, Pakistan and Nigeria, for example?
I think one of the...
Sorry, Ryan, go on, please.
Go, please.
No, go on. I was going to put my 2 pennies worth in about being a Brit and knowing many Brits and knowing the appeals of Africa. Yeah, I think this is a historical kind of interest in Africa. Certainly, very much from a British perspective, having friends who travel to Africa a lot. So I think it's a slightly different beast. Obviously, India falls into that gamut as well, with early P investors that happened there. But I think Africa has had that attraction, certainly from a European perspective, relative to, say, Bangladesh and perhaps Pakistan. You'll know that better than I do. But I think, generally speaking, I think in terms of general interest beyond the kind of the usual suspects, your CDCs, people like that, I think the interest has been relatively slow. But I think that's really been the kind of a function of where the hunting grounds has been for both Europeans and indeed Americans as well. I think the uptick that we've seen in the last 2 years has really happened from the West, certainly in Bangladesh. Before then, it was very much focused around Asian investors, or at least the offices of sometimes European or largely American investors, but certainly their Asian offices, whether that be Singapore or indeed India. That's where the interest has come. But I think the last 2 years, that whole construct has changed, where we're seeing actually, and maybe that's just down to Rahat selling Bangladesh particularly well, but we've definitely seen expand beyond the East Asian investors. But Rahat, please, sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I think one of the things that's been, because we've been trying to analyze why this has been happening, and I think Nigeria is interesting because I think a lot of people naturally see Nigeria as the first step towards the larger investment market in Africa. I think Pakistan is positioned really well to get access to MENA capital. A place like Indonesia or even Vietnam, Indonesia especially, has had a very prolific and vibrant public market. So a lot of the investors that are going in have roots there already in some capacity, and this is just the next step, right? Even, for instance, my ex-boss is a public market guy from who's heavily in Indonesia, and he was one of the people who seeded Gojek. That was like an organic shift there. In Bangladesh, I think we have our work cut out because we are kind of in the middle of things. That being said, I think I'd like to believe that the story is getting out there more and more. In terms of who we're getting inbound from, it's actually pretty broad. I would say, weirdly enough, the gap is actually India. We don't get much Indian venture, and I think that's because there's just a lot of activity going on. And I think Chinese inbound has not actually really been there, and I think that's partially because the sizes are not up to par. A lot of early stage interest from the US, especially in fintech, Southeast Asia. We've done a few deals there. Shahir, we co-led Shahir's round with a San Francisco fund and a Singapore fund. So you can see the diversity there. And then I think in Europe, we are seeing more and more interest, especially there are vestiges of Rocket Internet, floating around. And I think there are more and more people looking. The big thing for us is most people are looking for a $3, $4, $5 billion check, which means you're looking for a 7 million round, which means we need to get the companies up to a size where we can do a $7 million check. And that, I think, is we're probably a year away in this market to really see that at larger volumes.
Yeah, just a question. I mean, when you look at, you raised the point about Indonesia, and I think one of the phenomenon there that I've certainly seen a lot is, the big family groups, Wijaja and Riyadi and, SMDV and all those guys that the investment bankers on the community will know very well, extremely deep-pocketed, multi-billion-dollar families, and they've really led the charge in many ways in putting funds together, putting in SoftBank, Roderick Pawana at SMDV, which is the Wijaja family's platform. I mean, they've raised as much from SoftBank as they've raised domestically in Indonesia across 2 generations of funds now. So, I wanted to pass the question both to you and to Kalsoom as well, which is, when you look at the evolution of entrepreneurship in the Middle East, you see a similar phenomenon. You go to Saudi Arabia and you'll see the Mahidif family and, Prince Mohammed and Faisalia Group and all those guys, extremely active in family offices that then morph into corporate venture that make pretty big allocations. Crescent Enterprises, Jaffa family, significant investors in many mid-stage companies in the region here. So you're getting the big families writing, 10, 15, 20, $25 million checks. So I wanted to start really with Syeed and then pass to Kalsoom, which is, there's not a lack of family wealth in Pakistan, and I'm sure the same applies in Bangladesh. What could be done to pull those groups into more active corporate venture strategies?
Well, let me start first. Look, I think in Bangladesh, I think there is increased discussion happening within family groups. I think there has been a bit of a lag. I think it's probably this, after seeing different startups getting to some degree of scale, I think the next gen in some of the large family businesses are certainly having discussions with their families, and there is more interest happening. I think it's really more about finding the right construct and structure around being able to do that. Like we actually, the one piece of domestic capital that we manage is for BRAC, which is a very large NGO, but they also are the largest shareholders of the largest bank, MFI, as well as payments company. And the real premise for them wanting to invest into the startup ecosystem has actually been to help build the startup ecosystem and support young entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. But I think what's happening now, and I've had several conversations literally in the last month, where I'm seeing that some of the large families are interested in investing in startups. So there's some examples of it happening on a case-by-case basis, but in terms of it happening through an institutionalized vehicle, that's something that's kind of evolving. But I think that is certainly going to develop, and I can see that accelerating in Bangladesh as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, I mean, just one quick observation, Syeed, as well, is that similar to Pakistan. So we've had a bit of a lag as well. But what I will say is that it's really helpful when you have, to your point, Syeed, of some next gen family offices that are thinking ahead. And I would say that some of the earlier investors in the market were like people like Samad Marali and like people like Fayaz Tahir, like people that come from like, like more like of the established families, right, that were getting into this space quite early. In Pakistan, I would say that, we have had kind of a mixed experience, to be honest. I think some of the the state companies, the family companies in Pakistan have been a bit more vulture than venture capital in terms of taking a lot of equity early on in companies and maybe not being as progressive as they should be. But that's also was just a lack of exposure. I would also say from a psychology perspective, when you've had generational family companies, this idea of exits and this idea of liquidation events and so not taking so much equity up front so early are things that people are learning, right? And so what I would say, I mean, obviously we've had people like Humayun Mazhar and all of that. What I would say is that people like Ali Mukhtar have been like major game changers, right? So Fatima Gobi, so Ali started with, obviously he's part of the Fatima group, but Ali started as a next gen person, angel investing, then partnered up with Gobi Ventures for their fund, which is one of the most prolific investors in Pakistan now. But what I think, and I tell Ali this all the time, I think he's acted as such a great example for other next gen wealth. And we've seen this with our fund as well. There's been so many next gen of family offices that have been reaching out to us that are excited about the space. Sometimes the best way to get involved is being an LP in a fund like all of ours, right? That can actually invest and through that see how it's actually done. Or I know there's Bangladesh Angels as an example. In Pakistan, we're doing a lot more angel investor trainings. Like how can we actually train them to be better investors? And so I think there's been a bit of a lag. I wouldn't say a lag because they've been active, but maybe more of a sense of maybe they weren't playing the best role before. But I would say that with people that have acted as champions of this, I think that in itself, like if I was to tell someone as a next gen wealth holder to do it, it may not be as strong as if it was coming from someone like Ali or someone else who is another next gen wealth holder themselves, right? And I think that network effect is something that I think is a really important trend in both places.
Fantastic, great. And before we move on to questions, Syeed, do you want to pick up the point about e-commerce? Because we talked, health tech and education. Tell us what's happening in e-commerce in Bangladesh.
It's funny. I see Rahat smiling as I'm asked about e-commerce. So look, I think e-commerce has got several different aspects to it. So we've invested in a specialized e-commerce company that's in beauty and personal care, and we made that decision one because we like the sector, but in terms of that company or that sector versus general e-commerce, I think the underlying for e-commerce, as far as we have understood it, is that you need an ecosystem around it, whether it's payments, whether it's logistics, and then of course, most importantly, customer adoption, as well as customer kind of service, as it were, in terms of getting deliveries on time, being able to pay for it, cash on delivery, which is prevalent in the country, which I expect probably is the case in Pakistan as well. But in terms of returns, what happens there? So we kind of taken a house view that e-commerce would possibly take a bit longer. And I say this in the context of, which tech sector comes first in different countries. And certainly in Bangladesh, fintech came before e-commerce did. So I think it's kind of it's a tale of several different stories. I think it's certainly a sector which can take a significant amount of money to scale. But what I do think is positive that's happened across the board, and I think really certainly over the last 5-6 years, where there's been significant progress is on the payment side, as well as on the logistics side. I think on the logistics side, we really are seeing quite a few interesting things happening over time. I think one company we invested in, Praava, was one of the early kind of e-commerce logistics courier companies. But subsequent to that, obviously Shop Up with RedX, one of its product offerings has raised a significant amount of capital. There's a company, Paperfly, who also have had investment from an Indian company. And what they've effectively done is they've started to invest into the middle mile, as they call it, as well as the last mile. So, courier services have been strong, like in Dhaka and in some of the cities. But the question is, how do you get it across to another city and get to the last mile delivery, particularly rural? I think one of the things I'd pick up from what Shahir mentioned with his customer base being in rural as well. I think one of the big areas for e-commerce to expand and to scale, because I think, one of the things, and I'm not too sure what it's like in Pakistan, but in Bangladesh, entertainment is often wandering around shopping malls and buying things in shopping malls, because of the lack of other types of entertainment. But I think the rural communities obviously don't have access to those shopping malls. So I think investment in the broadband sector and rural broadband in particular is extremely important. That'd benefit both e-commerce as well as health tech, edutech, and those kind of things. So I think the broader ecosystem, in terms of a few prongs, logistics, courier, fintech has definitely come a long way from where it had before. I think they're short of a few sort of stories around certain e-commerce companies perhaps not acting in the way they should have. But I think broadly speaking, the larger players like Raz and a few other players as well, I can see the sector has evolved considerably over the last 5 or 6 years, despite unit economics being quite challenging. Certainly if you're doing general e-commerce. So yeah, I think it's all moving, but I wouldn't say e-commerce is not the first thing in Bangladesh. I think there's been other sectors that have actually grown faster and quicker before we get to kind of e-commerce more broadly.
Got it, thank you. We'll move on to a few questions. The questions are building up, so I better move on to them. First question, anyone can take it if they like. What is the best way to reach investors and venture teams with their startups in Bangladesh? I don't know if you want to pick up, Rahat.
I mean, if you're looking to invest in Bangladeshi startups, I think one of the great ways is there's a Bangladeshi Angels Network, bdangels.co, that I recommend. They've done a great job of kind of bringing together investors from abroad, both Bangladeshi and non-Bangladeshi, to invest in the market. And then in terms of news flow, I think that's something that we still need to kind of push more on. I think there's not enough news going out, but the good thing is I think we're going to see some things this year that'll really help that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's another one. What are the tips for Pakistani startups looking to expand into Bangladesh and vice versa? I don't know if you want to pick that up, Sylvana, just from your knowledge of Bangladesh and what a Pakistani startup might. What are the things to have as watch outs when you enter Bangladesh?
Well, I would say, I mean, my expertise is very specific to healthcare, but I would say generally speaking, I think one challenge that we see in emerging markets when startups try to expand from one market to the next is an assumption that it's going to be the same kind of an experience. And I don't think that's generally what happens, and particularly in healthcare where regulation and competition are so localized. And so I would just come to the table with a good degree of humility. And of course, there's IP. There's a lot that Pakistani startups and startups in other markets can bring. But it's very important, I think, to spend the time on the ground to really understand the local challenges. And I think that will dramatically increase your chance for success.
Can I add to that, Ovais? Is that okay?
I
think it's really important for anyone who's in Pakistan looking to expand to Bangladesh. To Sylvana's point, it is there. I mean, we're talking about a lot of the similarities. There are differences, and there is likelihood of there being a version of you already in Bangladesh. So I would actually really do your research and reach out. And so rather than thinking about just growing on your own, but actually thinking about partnering with or speaking to the players that are already doing this work that actually understand the landscape way better than you do. I also think that it's important to name some of the geopolitical barriers or some of the reasons why it might be difficult, because it's difficult for Pakistanis to get a visa to go to Bangladesh, right? We went for a training.
Mm-hmm.
We were training an incubator in Bangladesh, and none of my Pakistan team could get a visa, right? I could, because obviously I already have that connection. And so I think that's really important to actually know those barriers. So that's why creating relationships with people that are already on the ground and being able to do that work that way is one thing. The other quick thing that I would say is that it's really expensive to go from Pakistan to Bangladesh. And in some ways, it's actually probably as expensive from going from the US to Pakistan as it is to go to Pakistan to Bangladesh, because of just the challenge of you can't fly over India. We used to have direct flights from Dhaka to Karachi that my mom used to do all the time, but now it's you have to go through Dubai and all of that. So all of the logistics around it make it seem a little bit difficult, which is why building those relationships on the ground and really kind of doing the work and leveraging people on this panel, right, that understand the market way better than you do. And to Sylvana's point about humility is really important. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity to think about how we grow in each other's markets. And obviously, Syeed and Rahat are investors in Maya, and Maya has been in Pakistan as well. And so there's a lot of examples of that, but it really does require kind of learning how to navigate both and even the logistics around it.
I would just say one other piggyback on that, and that is that a lot of investors will want to pressure you to be in multiple markets, and we've gotten feedback from investors many times. We love your model. Let us know when you're ready to come to India. So I would say each of our markets is really big. So, I think that there's a lot that we can do in each of our markets. There's a lot of depth and breadth that can be achieved. And I would try not to cave to that pressure that investors, because they're familiar with a different market, may want to see you there. I would really focus on what you know and see what you can achieve in those markets first. And we're pretty steadfast on that, although I believe that our model can be scaled in other markets, that we have 170 million people in Bangladesh that I'd like to serve with high quality healthcare. And I'm really focused on that today.
I'd love to actually follow up on that, because I absolutely agree. I'll tell you, 2 years ago, when we started talking to potential investors for our fund, everybody's like, well, is Bangladesh big enough? And where are you going to go after? And we had that in the back of our mind, and we would talk to our potential founders and be like, hey, what are you going to do after Bangladesh? The more we've dove into the market, one thing we've realized is there are probably about 6 industries, including healthcare, fintech, education, that we think are multi-billion-dollar industries domestically. The other thing that I think is important to note, and I think this goes for both Pakistan and Bangladesh, I think when you have a lot of Western investors, when they're looking at TAM, they have a tendency to ask for a big number, because the SAM to TAM ratio, if you will, right, in most developed countries will never be more than, say, 2%, 3%, because these are very mature markets with very mature verticals. In places like our countries, honestly, if you have a first mover advantage and you have the right capital backing, you could be dominant. You could have 20%, 30% of the market. So the reality is, I don't think the desire necessarily to expand very early needs to be there, as long as you are definitely one of the leaders in the local space. I think ShopUp is a really interesting example, because I think what Afif is building over there right now, if that works, I think that's a $10 billion company, and that's not bad. That's a pretty good return last time I checked.
Yeah, well, I can certainly tell you about the burning of cash in geographic expansion until you've built a moat around your core market. Yeah. There are many stories of people who grew too fast. But what I'll do is quickly bust through the questions, and let's do a minute each on as many questions as we can. So here we go. Any examples of healthcare-related tech startups in Pakistan or Bangladesh, so we know what the trends are? Question from Ajmal. I guess that's for you, Sylvana.
Sorry, what was the question exactly?
Any examples of healthcare-related tech startups in Pakistan or Bangladesh, so we know what the trends are? So I guess, how does that fit? Yes.
Yeah, the hottest trends have been in telemedicine and e-pharma, which I think has been true not only in Pakistan and Bangladesh, but I think it's true globally. I think the challenge is there's not a lot of differentiation. And so I think that if you're looking to enter into either of those spaces, I would really try to figure out what you're going to be doing that's different. Because even globally, it's my view that telemedicine companies are to some extent a dime a dozen. And, yes, there's been a big boom in people accessing care virtually, and some of that will stick. But at some point there has to be some differentiation. So I'd look to models like Babylon that are really doing things really differently and innovatively that we can draw inspiration from for our markets. But I think there's also tons of opportunities in biotech, in remote chronic disease management, virtual primary care. I'd like to see some more depth of innovation in those spaces instead of another telemedicine or e-pharma company. But that's just my perspective.
I agree with that.
Quick one, perhaps for you, Rahat. How likely, easy is it for Bangladeshi startups to take an IPO exit?
That's $1 million question. And I think right now we're frankly too early in the ecosystem to really kind of surmise that. I think when we look for exits, I think majority of our companies, we envision an acquisition. And that's kind of been our mindset. But we do think there are certain aspects where international investors in the IPO market are willing to pay. I think things that are attached to consumer demand. So I mean, as something like an ed tech, or we're seeing what Grab and Gojek/Tokopedia are doing in Indonesia as well. The other thing that I think is interesting, and we're kind of checking progress on, is that the local stock market in Bangladesh is warming up to modifying some of the rules that would allow for startups to list. And I think that would be incredibly important in terms of increasing liquidity, funding into the market. Maybe it has initial dip in quality, but over time, we would hope that irons out. So I think if we can list local companies or companies locally, if we have more corporate venture locally, that's another big one that's missing right now. The exit possibilities skyrocket. That being said, from our side at Anchorless, we generally at this point do not invest in anything unless we have a clear line of sight into multiple potential acquirers, and often have had conversations with them in advance.
Got it, very clear. Question I think for you, Kalsoom, which is, where can we see accurate info, I suppose accurate data about investments and sectors in both countries?
In terms of for Pakistan, I mean, there's a lot of different people that are putting out data on Pakistan. Our research team at Invest2Innovate, so if you just go to invest2innovate.com/insights, we have an open source deal flow tracker on the startup deals, totally free, that have happened from 2015 to present. We create graphics and visualizations off of that. TechShaw does a really good job of that as well. Data Darbar also does, so you can definitely get that. We're also releasing our 2021 ecosystem study on Pakistan in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for that. You can also read our 2019 study that came out before. So data is a big thing for me. So I geek out about it. It's something that we put out. I know Rahat does that internally with Anchorless, and we've been talking about doing some cross stuff. I know that Bijan for Light Castle LCP does some really good insights, and that's what I've looked at when I've been looking at Bangladesh as a market. So if you go to Light Castle Partners and go to LCP's website, I think they have a really great repository of knowledge that you can leverage as well.
Great. Question that comes up often, I guess, with European investors, particularly, even more so than the US, is ESG and sustainable development goals and the impact orientation of companies that they are investing in. Open question to the panel, which is, to what extent, I guess, do sustainable development goals and ESG and impact feature in the business models that anybody sees in Pakistan and Bangladesh? Do you want to pick that up? I don't know if you want to pick that up, Syeed.
Yeah, sure. So we, part of our identity is also impact. So we do, when we look at investments and we look at our companies, we do have that lens on as well as track various kind of metrics or impact metrics. But I would say, in terms of Bangladesh, certainly, and I suspect Pakistan may be the same, I think the definitions of impact are, can be broadly defined, because impact in one country is different to impact on other countries, certainly developed countries. So I think coming back to, in terms of European investors, I think the important thing, certainly beyond sort of basic housekeeping rules in terms of ESG, beyond that, it really is about getting investors to understand what the relevant impact metrics are and what they actually mean in markets like ours. Because things are evolving over time, and what is available in, for example, in the West, may be quite different to what's available here. So I think it's certainly a evolving sector. I think the definitions are evolving as well, and there's definitely different schools of thought around that. But I think from our perspective is, being Bangladeshi, albeit with a Scottish accent, but being Bangladeshi is, we have a clear kind of view on what we think is important for the country, and that's what we particularly focus on. Yeah.
I think just to add to that, and first of all, Syeed, I love your Scottish accent. It's like so cool. But secondly, I would say that I think from, ESG, to your point, is evolving. It's, I think different players have different examples of that. In my perspective, like most companies in either market are addressing big problems, and so naturally have like impact underlying all of them. I think with a lot of development finance institutions that are funding a lot of the funds that are coming up, like, CDC, IFC, all of them, they bake ESG into one of their requirements for the funds. So then we're all commercial funds. All the VC funds in Pakistan are commercial funds, but because of also, it is forcing us to kind of build that muscle of what ESG looks like, because obviously you have like money coming from those funders that care about that. And I think, from my perspective, I think job creation is a very big part of ESG. And I think and every one of our companies in our portfolio, all the companies that are on this panel are doing that. Even that is the basic. And then beyond that, obviously a huge amount of impact.
Fantastic. So I'll wrap there exactly on the hour, 9 p.m. UAE, midday New York, and fantastic conversation. And it's not the end of it, because obviously we'll be doing this both with Bangladesh again, I hope, and also with other countries around our region. So I wanted to thank the panel, thank everybody for their tremendous contribution, thank everyone who's listened in, had some very good numbers, and thank you for everyone who submitted questions, and look forward to Ali and the team continuing this corridor series on Pak Launch in the next few months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ovais, for great
Thank you,
moderating.
Thank you, and come visit us in Bangladesh.
Bye.
We'd love to host all of you.
Fantastic. It's very, very good idea. Thank you
Have
very
a great
much.
day, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.